I spent 6 years building a specialty marketing division from nothing, and 3 weeks ago, my director took full credit for it in front of the entire regional leadership team, then quietly moved to push me out before I could say a word in my own defense. I need to walk through the whole thing, because what I ended up doing about it is still something people at my old company are talking about. I'm 36, and until recently, I worked as a senior marketing strategist at a mid-sized consumer goods company headquartered in a city called Wexford, about an hour outside Pittsburgh. I joined the company 9 years ago as a junior analyst and, over time, built out an entire specialty division focused on sustainable packaging partnerships, a niche nobody else in the company wanted to touch back when I first pitched it, but one that eventually became one of the company's fastest-growing revenue streams. For most of those years, I reported to a director named Patricia, who genuinely championed my ideas, gave me real credit in meetings, and helped me grow into the role I eventually earned. When Patricia retired 18 months ago, the company brought in someone new to lead the division, a man named Craig, transferred in from a competitor company with an impressive resume, but almost no background in sustainable packaging specifically. I want to be fair here. When Craig first started, I genuinely tried to make things work smoothly. I walked him through every partnership I'd built, every vendor relationship, every internal process that had taken years to develop. I assumed, reasonably, that a good director would want to understand the foundation he was inheriting before trying to change it. Craig, it turned out, had a very different management style than Patricia. He was polished in meetings, quick with buzzwords, and remarkably skilled at absorbing other people's work into his own narrative without ever technically lying about anything. Early on, it was subtle things, presenting his quarterly strategy to upper management using slides I'd built, referring to partnerships I'd personally negotiated as things we had developed under his leadership. Small enough shifts in language that calling them out directly would have made me look petty rather than accurate. Over 18 months, those subtle shifts compounded. My name started disappearing from project credits on internal documents. Client-facing emails that used to come from me started being sent under Craig's signature, with my original drafting quietly buried in the thread history. I brought this up to him directly, twice, framed as professionally as I could manage, and both times he brushed it off as an oversight, promising it wouldn't happen again, then continuing the exact same pattern within weeks. The moment everything came to a head happened 3 weeks ago, during the company's annual Regional Leadership Summit, an event with senior executives from 3 different states. The kind of meeting where visibility genuinely determines who gets considered for future promotions. Craig was scheduled to present an overview of the Sustainable Packaging Division's performance over the past year, numbers I had personally compiled, strategy slides I had personally built, case studies from partnerships I had personally negotiated and maintained for years. I assumed, as had happened in previous summits under Patricia, that I would be presenting alongside him, or at minimum, be acknowledged clearly for the work behind the numbers. Instead, Craig delivered the entire 20-minute presentation solo, referring to the division's strategy exclusively in first person, describing partnerships in language that implied he had personally built the relationships from the ground up. At one point, discussing our largest packaging partnership, a deal that had taken me almost a year of careful relationship building to close, he said, and I remember this exactly. I identified this opportunity early and made sure we moved on it before competitors could. I sat in that conference room, 3 rows back, watching senior executives nod along, watching Craig receive praise for work I had done, work he barely understood well enough to answer a single technical follow-up question about, which became obvious the moment the regional VP asked him a detailed question about the sustainability certification process, something Craig fumbled through vaguely before glancing, almost involuntarily, in my direction for help. I didn't jump in. Not yet. I sat there, quietly furious, watching him struggle through a question about work I could have answered in my sleep, and made a decision in that exact moment that I wasn't going to let this keep happening quietly. What I didn't know yet, sitting in that conference room, was that Craig had already started a much bigger plan, one that had nothing to do with taking credit for my work and everything to do with making sure I wouldn't be around much longer to notice it happening. The day after the summit, I found out exactly how far ahead Craig had actually been planning, and it had nothing to do with a single presentation. A colleague of mine, a project coordinator named Renee who'd worked closely with both me and Craig over the past year, pulled me aside near the break room and told me something she said she'd been debating whether to share for weeks. She said Craig had been quietly meeting with HR, separate from any standard performance reviews, and that one of the HR coordinators, a woman Renee was friendly with outside work, had mentioned in passing that Craig was building a documentation file on me. I asked her what that meant exactly. Renee said she didn't know all the details, just that it involved performance concerns, something about missed deadlines and communication issues, framed in a way that made it sound like a formal process building towards something serious. I sat with that information for the rest of the day, trying to figure out what missed deadlines Craig could possibly be referring to, since if anything, over the past 18 months, I'd been picking up extra work precisely because Craig routinely failed to follow through on details I usually caught and fixed quietly before they became client-facing problems. That evening, I did something I probably should have started doing the moment Craig arrived. I began keeping my own detailed records, time-stamped, of every project I worked on, every email I sent, every deadline I hit, cross-referenced against whatever version of events Craig might be building. I pulled up old sent folders, calendar invites, project management software logs, anything with a verifiable date attached to it. 3 days later, my suspicion was confirmed in the worst possible way. I got a calendar invite from HR, generic subject line, check-in meeting, scheduled for the following Monday, with Craig listed as a required attendee alongside an HR business partner I'd never interacted with directly before, a man named Steven. I walked into that meeting Monday morning with a folder of my own, printed copies of project timelines, email threads, performance metrics from the division I'd built, every piece of documented proof I could gather in 4 days. Steven opened the meeting by explaining that Craig had raised some concerns about my performance over the past several months, specifically citing 3 instances of missed deadlines on client deliverables and what he described as difficulty adapting to new leadership direction. I asked, calmly, if I could see specific dates and details for these 3 missed deadlines, since I kept thorough records and wanted to understand exactly what he was referring to. Craig hesitated, then named a project from 4 months earlier, a packaging certification report that had, in fact, been delayed, but delayed because Craig himself had sat on the initial vendor approval for almost 3 weeks before signing off on it. A delay I had multiple email threads specifically documenting, including 2 follow-up emails from me asking him to approve the vendor selection so I could move forward. I pulled that exact email thread out of my folder and slid it across the table. The room went quiet. Steven read through the emails carefully, then looked up at Craig, waiting for an explanation. Craig fumbled through something about the vendor approval process being more complicated than it looked on paper, which didn't really answer the actual timeline sitting in front of everyone in black and white. I could see, watching Steven's expression shift, that this meeting was not unfolding the way Craig had clearly expected it to. Steven ended that meeting by saying he needed time to review everything properly, that he'd follow up with both of us individually within the week, and asked me, specifically, if I had documentation for the other 2 missed deadlines Craig had mentioned as well. I told him I could pull together detailed timelines for anything he needed, and asked if he could send me the specific dates and project names Craig had referenced, so I could respond point by point instead of relying on vague memory. Steven agreed, and I could tell, watching him glance at Craig, that this request alone had already shifted something in how seriously he was taking Craig's original complaint. Walking out of that meeting, Craig caught up with me in the hallway, his tone completely different than it had been in the room, quieter, almost conciliatory. He said he thought we should clear the air, that things had gotten unnecessarily formal, and that maybe we could work things out between just the 2 of us instead of escalating further through HR. I told him, as evenly as I could manage, that I was happy to discuss things professionally, but that I wasn't willing to pretend a documented HR meeting citing performance concerns hadn't happened, and that going forward, I'd be keeping written records of everything discussed between us, for both our protection. He didn't like that answer. I watched something shift in his expression, brief but unmistakable, less concern about clearing the air and more calculation about what his next move needed to be. 2 days later, Steven sent me the full list of the 3 missed deadlines Craig had cited. The second one turned out to be a client presentation deck that had gone out a day later than originally scheduled. Again, delayed because Craig had requested last-minute changes to the strategy slides less than 24 hours before the original deadline. Changes I'd implemented and resubmitted within hours, well within any reasonable definition of meeting a revised timeline he himself had created. The third instance was even thinner, a weekly status report that had technically been sent 40 minutes after its usual time slot, on a day I'd been in back-to-back client calls that Craig himself had scheduled. I compiled detailed, dated responses to all 3 instances, attaching original email threads, calendar records, and project management logs showing timestamps for every relevant action. I sent the full document to Steven, copying nobody else, keeping this entirely through official HR channels the way he'd requested. Steven's response came back 3 days later, and it was more direct than I expected corporate HR communication to ever be. He wrote that after reviewing the documentation thoroughly, the performance concerns as originally presented did not appear to be substantiated, and that he'd be recommending no formal action be taken against me based on Craig's complaint. He also added one more line, careful in its phrasing but unmistakable in its implication, that he'd be scheduling a separate follow-up conversation regarding leadership practices within the division. A phrase that told me this wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. Something bigger was starting to move, and for the first time since Craig had arrived 18 months earlier, I felt like the ground under him might finally be shifting instead of mine. The leadership practices conversation Steven mentioned happened the following week, but not before something else happened first, something that made it clear Craig wasn't planning to just sit back and wait for HR to finish looking into him. Word started circulating quietly around the office that I was difficult to work with, a phrase that reached me secondhand through 2 different colleagues within the same week, always vague, always unattributed, but consistent enough in phrasing that it clearly traced back to one source. Renee mentioned she'd overheard Craig, in a casual conversation near the elevators, describing me to another director as someone who struggled with feedback and didn't always play well with new leadership. I didn't confront him about it directly. I'd learned by this point that direct confrontation just gave Craig room to reframe things in the moment, calm and reasonable on the surface, while continuing the same pattern the second the conversation ended. Instead, I kept doing exactly what had worked so far, documenting everything, staying professional in every interaction, and letting the paper trail speak for itself. The leadership practices meeting with Steven turned out to be far more extensive than I expected. He'd apparently spoken with 4 other people in the division beyond just me, including Renee and 2 other team members I hadn't realized had their own concerns about Craig's management style. Steven asked me directly, in that meeting, whether I felt comfortable sharing specific examples of how credit had been handled within the division over the past 18 months. I hesitated for a moment, not because I didn't have the examples, I had plenty, but because some part of me still worried about being labeled as bitter or difficult, exactly the narrative Craig had already started planting. I decided, in that moment, that staying quiet to avoid a label was exactly the pattern that had let this go on for 18 months in the first place. So I laid it out clearly, methodically, the same way I'd laid out the missed deadline documentation. The disappearing bylines on internal reports. The client emails sent under his signature using my original drafts. The regional summit presentation where he'd taken sole credit for a partnership I'd spent a year building, then couldn't answer a basic technical question about it without looking to me for help. Steven took detailed notes throughout, asking clarifying questions, but never once making me feel like I was exaggerating or overreacting, which, after 18 months of exactly that kind of dismissal from Craig himself, felt like its own strange relief. Toward the end of the meeting, Steven told me something I hadn't expected to hear so directly from HR. He said the pattern I was describing, combined with what 2 other team members had independently reported using strikingly similar language, was being taken seriously at a level above just our division, and that a more formal review process was likely to begin soon, involving people well above Craig's own management chain. I left that meeting with a strange mix of vindication and exhaustion, relieved that someone was finally listening, but tired in a way that 18 months of quietly absorbing someone else's credit-taking apparently builds up in a person without them fully realizing it until the pressure finally starts to lift. What I didn't know yet was that Craig, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, was about to make one final move, a move aimed directly at pushing me out of the company entirely before that formal review could ever conclude. The move came 10 days later on a Wednesday morning in the form of a calendar invite titled simply Role Restructuring Discussion from Craig directly, no HR representative listed as an attendee this time. I walked into his office already wary, and my instincts turned out to be right. Craig opened by telling me that, given ongoing tension within the division, he decided the best path forward was to restructure my role, moving me out of my senior strategist position and into a newly created position he called Sustainability Program Coordinator, a title that sounded similar on paper but came with a demotion in both scope and, when I asked directly, a 15% pay cut. He framed it as an opportunity, said it would let me focus on what I do best, without the pressure of strategic leadership responsibilities, language that, after 18 months of learning exactly how Craig operated, I recognized immediately as a polished way of saying he wanted me quietly sidelined before the ongoing HR review could conclude in a way that reflected badly on him. I asked him directly if this restructuring was connected in any way to the ongoing leadership review Stephen had mentioned. Craig said, a little too quickly, that it was completely separate, a decision he'd been considering for a while, based purely on organizational needs. I didn't sign anything in that meeting. I told him I needed time to review the proposed changes and would respond formally within a few days, then walked straight from his office to Stephen's, calendar invite and all. Stephen's reaction told me everything I needed to know about how seriously this was already being taken above Craig's level. He asked me to forward him the restructuring proposal immediately, said the timing, less than 2 weeks into an active review specifically examining Craig's leadership practices, was, in his words, not going to look good, and asked me to hold off responding to Craig until he could loop in someone from senior HR leadership. 2 days later, I got a call, not from Stephen this time, but from the VP of Human Resources directly, a woman named Diane Reyes, someone I'd never spoken with personally in 9 years at the company. She asked if I could come in for a conversation, just the two of us, away from the division entirely. Sitting across from her, I laid out the entire timeline again, calmly, with the same documentation I'd already shown Stephen, but this time adding the restructuring proposal as the most recent piece. Diane listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes, and near the end asked me a question that genuinely surprised me. She asked what outcome I actually wanted, whether I wanted to stay in the division under new leadership, whether I wanted a transfer, or whether, given everything, I wanted something else entirely. I sat with that question for a long moment before answering honestly. I told her I loved the division I'd built, loved the work itself, but that after 18 months of watching credit disappear and now facing a clear demotion timed suspiciously close to a review examining exactly that pattern, I no longer trusted that staying under Craig's leadership, in any capacity, was something I was willing to do. Diane nodded, closed her notebook, and told me she appreciated my honesty and that she'd be moving forward with next steps far sooner than she'd originally planned. 5 days after that conversation with Diane, I got an email requesting a formal meeting, this time with Diane, a senior VP named Robert Alvarez who oversaw the entire consumer products division, and, notably, no Craig on the invite list at all. Walking into that conference room, seeing Robert there in person, someone I'd only ever interacted with briefly at company-wide events, made it clear this had moved far beyond a standard HR complaint. Diane opened the meeting by confirming that the investigation into Craig's leadership practices had concluded, and that they'd substantiated a consistent pattern across multiple team members, myself included, involving credit misattribution, questionable performance documentation used to undermine specific employees, and now the poorly timed restructuring proposal targeting me directly during an active review. Robert spoke next, more directly than I expected senior leadership to be in a room like this. He said the company took this seriously, not just because of the impact on me individually, but because the sustainable packaging division's revenue growth over the past several years. The numbers Craig had presented as his own achievement at the regional summit had actually been driven almost entirely by partnerships and strategy one had personally built, something their internal review had now clearly documented through project records, client correspondence, and interviews with several partner companies I'd worked with directly. He told me, plainly, that Craig would be terminated effective immediately and that the restructuring proposal targeting my role was being formally rescinded and struck from my file entirely. Then he asked me something I genuinely hadn't expected. He asked if I would be interested in stepping into the director role myself, overseeing the division I'd essentially built from the ground up, with full title, full compensation adjustment, and direct reporting to Robert rather than through the layer of management that had allowed this situation to happen in the first place. I sat there for a moment, processing everything, 9 years of work, 18 months of quietly absorbing someone else's credit-taking, weeks of building documentation just to defend my own position, all converging into a single conversation that could completely reshape the next chapter of my career. I told Robert the first needed a day to think it over, not because I doubted whether I wanted the role, but because I wanted to make sure I was accepting it clearly, on my own terms. Not simply as a reactive decision made in the emotional aftermath of everything that had just happened. Walking out of that building that afternoon, I called Renee first, the colleague who'd first warned me about Craig's documentation file all those weeks ago, the person whose small act of honesty had ultimately started unraveling this entire situation. I told her what had happened, and she was quiet for a moment before saying something that stuck with me the rest of the day. She said, "You didn't get lucky. You just refused to let him control the story." That night, sitting at home going over everything, I realized she was right. Every step of this, the documentation, the calm responses in meetings, the refusal to sign that restructuring proposal without review, none of it had been about luck. It had been about refusing to let someone else's version of events become the only version anyone believed. I said yes to the director role 2 days later, after a long conversation with my husband about what it would actually mean to lead the division formally, publicly, with my name finally attached to the work I'd been doing quietly for years. The transition wasn't instant or entirely smooth. Craig's departure was handled quietly on the company's end, an internal announcement citing a standard leadership change, without going into specifics, which I understood from a corporate liability standpoint. Even if part of me wished the full story could have been shared as clearly to the wider team as it had been laid out to me in that conference room. Word still traveled, the way it always does in an office. Within a week, most of the division understood, in broad strokes, what had actually happened, not because HR announced it, but because Renee and 2 other colleagues who'd given their own accounts during the investigation quietly shared pieces of the truth with people they trusted. I never asked them to. I think, honestly, people were simply relieved to finally say out loud what they'd been noticing for 18 months without a safe way to voice it. My first official act as director was small but deliberate. I went back through every project report, every case study, every internal document from the past 18 months where credit had been misattributed, and quietly corrected the record, not with any dramatic announcement, just careful, accurate documentation restoring proper attribution to the people who'd actually done the work, myself included, but also 2 junior team members whose contributions had been folded into Craig's narrative just as thoroughly as mine had. One of those team members, a data analyst named Priya who'd been with the division for just under 2 years, came to my office about a week after the correction and told me it was the first time in her career someone in leadership had gone back and fixed something like that without her having to ask. She said it made her actually want to stay long-term, something she admitted she'd been quietly questioning before all of this happened. That comment stuck with me more than almost anything else that happened during this entire situation. Craig's approach to leadership had cost the company more than just my temporary frustration. It had been quietly eroding trust across an entire team, one small credit-taking moment at a time, until people who genuinely loved their work started wondering if staying was even worth it. 3 months into the new role, the division posted its strongest quarter yet, driven largely by 2 new partnerships I'd been quietly developing even during the worst of the conflict with Craig. Work I'd kept moving forward specifically because I refused to let uncertainty about my job security stop me from doing what I actually knew how to do well. Robert stopped by my office personally to share the quarterly numbers and mentioned, almost in passing, that the board had specifically asked about the division's turnaround during a recent leadership meeting, and that his answer had been simple, that the growth had never actually stalled. It had just finally been given room to be seen clearly, without someone standing in front of it claiming the light for themselves. It's been 8 months now since Craig walked out of that office for the last time, and I want to close this out properly, because a lot of people have asked me how everything actually settled once the dust cleared. The division has continued growing steadily under my leadership, 3 consecutive strong quarters now. 2 of the partnerships I closed during those final chaotic weeks with Craig have since become some of the largest accounts in the entire company's portfolio. Robert has given me full autonomy over hiring, and I've since brought on 2 more people to the team, including promoting Priya into a senior analyst role, something I made sure to announce clearly and publicly, the exact opposite of how my own contributions had been treated for so long. I heard through industry contacts months later that Craig landed a director-level position at a different company in a neighboring state. I won't pretend that news didn't sting a little at first, the idea that someone could walk away from a documented pattern of credit-taking and still land comfortably somewhere else. But I've made peace with the fact that I can't control what happens to him next, only what I choose to build going forward, and honestly, the version of my career I'm building now is stronger and more mine than anything I had before he ever arrived. Renee still works closely with me, and we've become genuinely close over the past 8 months, not just colleagues navigating a difficult situation together, but real friends who trust each other completely. Something built directly out of her original willingness to tell me the truth when it would have been far easier to stay quiet. I still think sometimes about that regional summit, sitting 3 rows back watching Craig struggle to answer a question about work I could have explained in my sleep. I think about how close I came to just letting it go, telling myself it wasn't worth the conflict, that maybe I was overreacting, the exact narrative he'd spent 18 months quietly building around me. What I've learned, walking through all of this, is that the moment you start doubting your own documented reality just to avoid being labeled difficult, you've already handed someone else control of your story. The paper trail, the calm documentation, the refusal to sign anything without review, none of that was about being combative. It was about refusing to let silence become the only version of events anyone ever heard. I run the division now with a simple rule I didn't need to write down anywhere, because it's just how I lead. Everyone's name stays on their own work. Every contribution gets acknowledged clearly, in real time, not corrected quietly months later after someone finally speaks up. It's not complicated. It just requires someone in leadership actually caring enough to do it. So here's what I actually want to know from all of you. If you were in my position, watching someone take credit for years of your work right in front of senior leadership, would you have started documenting everything quietly the way I did? Or would you have confronted them directly in that meeting the moment it happened? Let me know honestly in the comments below.